So the comment about violence is actually a great segue, because I want to talk a little bit about the chapter on Westerns that you wrote.
Yeah.
And so fill us in. I mean, it's something that's been written about pretty widely, especially as of late.
Yep.
Tristan Dumas just wrote
Yep.
Jesus and John Wayne.
Yep.
And
Which I engage a little bit in here.
Yeah. And it seems to me, I haven't finished her book yet, but it seems to me that what she's arguing is that the evangelical perspective is very much that Jesus is a kind of John Wayne for us, right? Or that we need to turn Jesus into John Wayne. And that's the image that we've created, and it's the image that we've worshiped and that we've become addicted to, right? And you have a little bit of a different approach.
Yeah. You could probably read her book in a couple of different ways, because a lot of her book is just kind of reporting on things evangelical leaders have said about masculinity and violence and so on.
That's right.
So you can read what she's up to in a couple of different ways. But I will say, I think that at least the way her book has been received largely is that evangelicals, at least white evangelicals, are kind of drawn to John Wayne for the same reasons they're drawn to Jesus, and Jesus for the same reasons they're drawn to John Wayne, right? And that they're looking for a kind of man who's willing to do violence against bad people in the name of defending the weak and the vulnerable. You know, it's like a kind of that we need strength and to make a show of strength. So I think and I think that's by and large right. I mean, again, much of the book is just telling us what was said, right? So I mean, it's in that way not a lot to disagree with, but I do think that the account is more complicated than the book suggests, and definitely more complicated than kind of pop perception of the book suggests. In terms of how Americans and American Christians and American evangelical Christians think about masculinity and violence, I think the story it's a little more complicated than is usually seen.
Right. So that's one of the directions that you go on your chapter on Westerns, is that John Wayne isn't Jesus and Jesus isn't John Wayne, but we need the John Waynes so that Jesus can be who Jesus needs to be.
That's how I think the way the model actually works. Right? That there's part of the, and here, for those of you who are interested in this, there's a man named Richard Slotkin who's a scholar. I don't know if he's still alive or not, but he wrote a series of gigantic books on the myth of redemptive violence. And he kind of traces the history of American storytelling, like what stories do Americans tell about themselves, and makes the case that really these stories are always stories about the frontier, the new, the savage land that's conquered by what he calls the hero or the pioneer hero, who is breaking into virgin territory or savage territory and making it safe for people to follow, right? Yeah. And he, again, it's a multi-volume series and each book is massive, but the heart of his idea is that Americans believe violence is necessary, that for any good to happen, there has to be violence against those who are not good. And for any good that has happened, there has to be a readiness for violence for that good to stay, right? And that this is just like built into the American mentality, right? Like that we believe violence is good, right? Or can be. Not that it always is, but that it can be. And I think we all sense this and can feel this like at even the most kind of pop culture level possible. You've seen like the bumper stickers that say only 2 people have ever died for your freedom, Jesus and the American soldier. Like that kind of sentimentality, like that's the idea, right? That freedom isn't free. Well, what does it cost? Well, it costs death. But not just anyone's death, specifically the death of the soldier, right? The death of the person who's willing to do violence in our name for the sake of freedom. And that is, and I think that the Western, what I'm arguing in that chapter, which is the chapter on Epiphany. So I don't know if you mentioned it briefly, but let me back up a little bit to say, so the book is arranged around the seasons of the Christian year, starting with Advent, which is the season we're in now, and moving all the way to ordinary time. But this chapter, the one that Father Paul's just asked me about, is about Epiphany, the Feast of Epiphany, which celebrates the baptism of Jesus, the transfiguration of Jesus, the moment at which Jesus is kind of revealed to be the Savior of all. This is the Lamb of God who's come to take away the sins of the world. And the title of the chapter is The Name Above All Names. And so the idea is how do we name Jesus rightly? And then I argue that the Western, and this is true of both like our books, like the Louis L'Amour books, but also our movies. John Wayne is the iconic figure here. That those books and movies, those stories are stories that are trying to name something that's essentially American. And this goes back even to really before the Western, to stories about the pioneers, people like Daniel Boone, and historical figures like Boone and Davy Crockett, but also fictionalized figures like Natty Bumppo, who's a part of the Leatherstocking novels, the Last of the Mohicans mythology, right? Like all of those stories are centered around a hero, a hunter hero or a pioneer hero who is willing to do violence. And Slotkin picks up on this, and I'm sketching some of it in the chapter, that this is almost always a man, like almost always a man who's an outsider to every community. So like with the Natty Bumppo character who becomes, like in Last of the Mohicans movie, Daniel Day-Lewis plays him, he's white, but he lives with the Indians.
Right.
He speaks their language, right? They're his brothers. He's blood brothers with them, right? But when the bad Indians are threatening the good whites, like that's where he becomes necessary. Mm-hmm. And that becomes like part of the fundamental story that just shows up over and over and over and over again, right? That you've got this outside figure who's incredibly skilled. He's usually not a true believer. Like one of the things that's fascinating about this is usually this hero is not a Christian. And he needs not to be a Christian because he's going to do things for Christians that Christians can't do for themselves.
Yeah.
Right? Because their faith won't allow it. You guys remember the John Wayne, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. So in that movie, John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart are the big stars. And Jimmy Stewart plays this kind of man from the East, very cultured man who comes to the West to kind of bring law and order without violence to this town. And there's an outlaw there who's also played by a super famous actor. His name's slipping to mind right now. But have any of you seen this? It's an old movie. You should definitely watch it. I'm going to spoil it for you though, so get ready.
It's been out long enough.
Yeah, exactly. Like you don't. Yeah, I'm not going to spare you the spoiling. But it comes down to he's just going to. Jimmy Stewart's character is just going to have the shootout with the outlaw, even though he doesn't want to. Lee, yes, thank you very much. He's going to have to. I knew it was somebody famous, and I couldn't think of who it is. It's terrific though, movie, and. So, but in the decisive moment, John Wayne, who's the good bad guy, or the bad good guy, whichever way you want to put it, actually does the shooting from hiding. Right? So that what people perceive, the public view, is that the good marshal did what had to be done, even though he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to commit violence, but he did to save us from the bad guy. But what was really happening behind the scenes, right, is that the bad good guy or the good bad guy was doing the dirty work, right? So jump forward to the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, right? You get that exact same story, the Dark Knight, right, of Batman, who has to do in the dark what nobody wants done. Nobody wants to do it, nobody wants it done, but it has to be done, right? And so he's the hero, right? And there's that line in which the commissioner says at the end of the movie, right? He's the hero, not the hero we deserve, but he's the hero that we need.
Yeah.
Right? We need somebody who will do violence in our name, but not make us accountable for it. Mm-hmm. Right? So what this story means is that good bad guy or bad good guy always has to end up in exile. Right? So like Natty Bumppo, the character in the Leatherstocking novels, he dies alone without children and is only honored by the natives. Like the white people that he rescues, they're done with him. He's done his work, right? He's protected them, and now he goes off into oblivion. John Wayne in The Searchers, which I think is kind of the great Western movie around these themes anyway. Again, if you haven't seen it, I'm about to spoil it. But John Wayne plays a former Confederate officer. After the Civil War, he's kind of famously known for his hatred for native peoples and for the Indians. And then this young girl gets kidnapped, and he gets brought in to rescue her. And part of the drama of the movie is, will he actually rescue her, or will he just kill her too? Mm-hmm. Right? Because the thing he says he hates more than even the Reds are the people who are white and then turn. Mm-hmm. Right? Like they're rejecting their own whiteness, and he hates them for it. But he does, in the end, he does the right thing and doesn't kill her. He brings her back to the family. But in this incredibly iconic scene, one of the most famous scenes in American movie history, at the very end of the movie, he brings her home, her and her boyfriend who's going to marry her, and they go up the steps into that ranch house, back to the family. And the camera now is inside, looking out through the door, the open door, and behind John Wayne you can see like the prairie, like the desert. And he walks up the steps and moves toward the door and then stops. Right? So everybody else is in the house, and the camera angle is from in the house. So you and I are in the house too, right? We're looking out with everybody else in the house, rejoicing because the rescue has happened, salvation has come. But we're looking out on the John Wayne who did all of that for us, but he can't come in. And then he turns and walks away, right? And that door shuts behind him. And that image like shows up again and again and again and again, right? Before the latest group of Star Wars movies came out, like I was teaching a class on film and talking about this theme, and I told them that has to happen to Luke Skywalker next. Like he has to get exiled. Like, because in American storytelling, in order to be a hero, you have to do things that are bad. Yeah. But you have to pay for that bad by living and dying alone after that, right? And so I could go on forever about this, so you're gonna have to stop me. But I think that what it comes down to is it's kind of been drilled into us that we need Jesus for some things and John Wayne for other things. Mm-hmm. Right? We need Jesus to save our souls and John Wayne to save our bodies. Mm-hmm. Right? We need Jesus to make sure we go to heaven when we die and not hell. And we need John Wayne to make sure that our kids have a future of freedom and not communism. Right? We need to make sure, or whatever the enemy is at the time. We need Jesus there to forgive us for using John Wayne, but we need John Wayne there when we can turn away from Jesus to say, okay, you're going to have to do this. Yeah. Right? Like we don't want to do this, but it has to be done. Right? And so that there's this kind of fundamental conflictedness in us about it. And what it comes down to then is we want to believe that Jesus is always there to forgive the sin of letting John Wayne do that in our name. Now, John Wayne himself cannot be forgiven. Like, right. That's part of the story, is that the person who does that does not get reconciled back to the community. Mm-hmm. Right?
It's a scapegoat.
Yeah, exactly. That's precisely right. Right. So Jesus is, if you put it in those terms, John Wayne is the scapegoat and Jesus is the lamb. Mm-hmm. And we think we need both.
Yeah.
Right. We need the John Wayne figure who will do the stuff that Jesus would never do. Or if Jesus does it, he does Jesus may drive people out of the temple, but he doesn't, scalp them when he's done, right? But we do need someone to scalp some people, or it's just going to get worse and worse, right? So we need a scapegoat and a lamb. Mm-hmm. And in part, we need the lamb because of how bad we feel about scapegoating.
Yeah.
Right? And so Jesus then becomes a way of redeeming us from that. And so could go on forever. The way I end the chapter, though, is by trying to show how the story might work differently. Like what are other stories that don't assume that don't assume that's the way in which justice gets done in the world? Like what do those stories look and sound like?
Yeah.